Alrighty then. So, hello and welcome everyone. We have been talking about a lot of rather unfortunate history. We talked about the Philippine insurrection and American Small Wars, Jim Crow, and all that kind of stuff in the last couple of weeks. Um, but today is going to be a bit more of a gleam of hope for American history because we're going to be talking about progressivism. Now, and excuse my cat doing what cats do um, off there in the corner. But the um, today we're going to be talking about progressivism. But before we get to that, um, there's also going to be a oh, he's going to be annoying, isn't he? Um, there's a there will be a test this week. I mean, not a test, a quiz. Um, just like last time, it'll be 5 questions, multiple choice, um, based off of the lectures or the readings, um, including all the way up until today. So it could include something from today as well. Um, but um, that will be available. Um, well, let's say it'll be available on Wednesday, um, and the will be available from Wednesday until Friday night at the end of the day. 11:59 p.m. So it shouldn't take very long, especially if you've been paying attention to the lectures and the and doing your reading journals. Um, this should be relatively quick. Um, but it does have like a time limit of like 2 hours or something like that. Um, but if you're taking more than 2 hours, then you're you're going you haven't studied enough. um, because if this was in person, you guys would only have 10 minutes. Um, so the any questions on that before we get started with the lecture?
Will the readings this week also be included on the quiz this week?
The readings this week are
Yeah.
potentially on the quiz. Any other questions? All right, let's move on to the lecture then. Um, hold on a second while I hit share screen. There we go. So, today we're going to be talking about progressivism. Um, now, progressivism in the United States is a weird, uh, weird topic because normally when we think of progressivism elsewhere, um, that tends to have it tends to be leaning towards socialism. That um, that it is progress towards socialism is the normal idea of progressivism elsewhere in the world. But the US is fairly unique when it comes to how we handle debates over socialism, to say the least. Um, Basically, the word is verboten. Um, but um, there was a brief instance of powerful socialist of a powerful socialist uh party, um and they wanted to have full on socialism rather than progress towards it. But in the US, typically progressivism doesn't really have an endpoint in mind. It's always short term goals. Um, as opposed to elsewhere in the world. The you know Today we might talk about progressivism as being police reform, or the Green New Deal is another example of progressivism in the U.S. right now. Um, so these aren't really the same kind of thing that uh, progressives in like European countries would do. Um, so keep that in mind when we're talking about progressivism. It's always short-term goals, and you'll see that those goals morph over time as we go from the 1890s all the way into 1912. Um, and so the origins of progressivism actually mostly begin with the Democratic Party, because Republicans, as you might remember from previous classes, held a majority of power throughout the late 19th century. Um, Republicans at points were quite radical, as we saw with the Reconstruction lecture, but they also were the establishment party, meaning that they were uh, the powers that be. They set the agenda for the entirety of legislation. So the Democrats ended up becoming the de facto opposition party. They while there were points throughout the 19th century that they actually held a majority of power, namely during depressions, those were temporary aberrations from the system as a whole. And so as the Republicans maintained power, they also cozied up to big business as it was starting to gain power and start imposing all those monopolies that we talked about in the Gilded Age lecture. So um, this was the growth of capital and all that was essentially unregulated, what's known as laissez-faire, which is French for hands off. Um, but one could also argue that this was what is called crony capitalism, that essentially the US government was propping up these monopolies through systems of patronage and the spoil system and all that kind of stuff through corruption. Um, but it's not legal corruption, as in like something that is illegal. It is, um, you know, fostered by the government through legal means, as in like giving railroad companies, as they're building huge swaths of territory on either side of the railroad that they're building. Um, so these companies really didn't come to power without the help of the U.S. government. So the idea of laissez-faire may not actually hold any water. Um, but as we'll see later on in this course, towards the end of the course, the idea of laissez-faire capitalism returned again in the 1970s and 80s, and did the same thing where they proclaim that, oh, we're not regulating anything, we're keeping our hands off liberty and freedom, all that kind of stuff, but at the same time giving all these kinds of subsidies to big business. um, Things like too big to fail. So obviously there's a lot of opposition to this kind of stuff. All this wealth is being accumulated by an elite, whereas most Americans are in dire straits. So a group called the Populists really started making waves in the 1890s. They came from a variety of prior movements. Um, Two kind of opposing thing, origins were greenbackers who were who wanted what's called fiat currency. Now, fiat currency means that it's, we have fiat currency today. Actually, we have had fiat currency since the 1970s, but although arguably since the 1930s too. Uh, but we don't have to get into the oddities of that. But the main idea of fiat currency is that it's not backed by anything. You can't go and exchange a dollar bill for a certain amount of gold. Um, but at this point, there had been a what's often called the crime of 76, when the US officially went from a bimetallic system, as in um, that a dollar was worth one piece of gold or three pieces of silver. A, a The US had been bimetallic since the 1820s. Um, though for a little bit in there, the U.S. currency was basically useless because of Andrew Jackson. But the bimetallists wanted to go back to that because they saw that the move to a pure gold standard, as in there was no silver backing the money, was actually going to hurt um, you know smaller people who could such as farmers and proletarians, laborers, um, because they could not uh, pool their wealth in gold in that. So having it stamped on that meant that the inflation would would hurt smaller people rather than big business in that. And inflation under the gold standard was particularly helpful to big business. Um, but uh, you could tell that these two things actually contradict each other. That bimetallism and fiat currency, as in greenbackers, since our money is greenbackers. Um, that they wanted to return to an old monetary system. Greenbackers, by the way, the during the Civil War, there had been fiat currency um, because of war needs. The U.S. removed the metal backing just to be able to finance the war, but that was a temporary measure. Went right back to bimetallism, and then after 1876, it was the gold standard. Um, so many populists believed in either one of those two things. Um, you can see here the eventual leader the uh, of the populist party, William Jennings Bryan, made a very famous speech in the 1890s saying, "You shall not crucify mankind on a cross of gold." So people felt very strongly about how to sort out the backing of U.S. currency. When it changed in 1876, hardly anyone cared. But after the Depression of 1892, people started really caring because they saw inflation not going their way. At the same time, there was the Grange movement. The Grange movement was a bunch of farmers who who were bending together to basically be able to afford farm supplies. They really disliked the way that railroads were starting to monopolize how grain and produce and that was transported throughout the nation, and that they um, had to basically pay whatever the monopoly wanted, because the monopoly could charge anything and they had no competition to guarantee a lower price. So Grangers would often have like group silos where they would have a place where everyone could put their grain together and collectively bargain for the the cost of transport in that. So this was quite a grassroots movement. Um, so these two things, the fight for a change in the monetary system, and the fight over railroad monopolies in that, and their effect on a largely rural nation, um, were came together with the populist movement, um, or the American Popular Party. The or the I meant the American People's Party. Um, the People Party, or just populists for short, ran their own candidate throughout the 1890s, but in 1896 they joined with the Democrats. Remember, the Democrats were basically seen as the opposition party. So they joined with the Democrats to foster William Jennings Bryan, pictured here, um, to run against the Republican McKinley. This didn't work out too well for him. And they ended up losing the election and also kind of all power. But the the movement was very significant in terms of just infusing ideas of a need for significant change, especially against all of this laissez-faire capitalism. Um, so one of the answers was the rise of the Socialist Party. Um, the uh, the Socialist Labor Party, which was an offshoot of the Knights of Labor Party, um, broke up in the late 19th century into several different groups, uh, and mostly because they were fighting amongst themselves over what was the best policy to pursue and how to gain votes. Um, and that was kind of the high mark of socialism in the U.S. was the late 19th and early 20th century. Um, was They were powerful enough to be infighting, but because of how prominent they got, for instance, there were a couple of governors elected throughout the U.S. who were actual socialists. Um, social Socialism was offered as an answer to corruption, as in, you know, impose instead of having all these monopolies, nationalize those businesses, or um, guarantee some sort of right to work for all citizens, that if they chose to work, that they were guaranteed a job in some way. Um, these were some of the policy proposals of socialism, and a lot of the people in power saw this as quite scary. That the idea of nationalizing an industry, although the U.S. would actually do this in a number of ways. For instance, current nationalized industries would be like PBS, as in the public broadcasting system, NPR, a radio program, Amtrak, which is a national corporation that runs a lot of the railroads, and that. So the U.S. actually would end up instituting some of these socialist policies, but much later, often because of wartime. Um, but especially since the Republican Party was so cozy with um, with uh, industry, with with all these monopolies and all that, they definitely didn't want to nationalize them because that would not make them as much money. Um, so the all this focus on what the government can do also changed how um, the businesses started to run themselves. So this guy named Frederick Wilson Taylor um, started a movement often called Taylorism, as that would focus on the efficiency of the worker. And essentially, they would take a mundane task that workers are supposed to do, like fitting wheels on a car or something like that, and they'd take a bunch of pictures of workers doing that, measure with measurements so that they can see exactly how much time it's taking to put on the wheel, to put on the jacks and all that kind of stuff. um, and they would theorize how to make that job even more efficient, how to make such minor movements into even more efficiency, so that these monopolies could gain even more from their laborers. Um, this wasn't about trying to increase the worth of a laborer, since the laborers weren't gaining anything in terms of pay. um, they were trying to gain more from that labor. Um, and so this started to increase the people's unwillingness to deal with all these monopolies. It started to um, you know give more impetus to socialists in that. Um, Alongside all of this was the temperance movement. The temperance movement was headed by the Anti-Saloon League, which had been around since for most of the 19th century, and essentially they would try to get people to um, to promise that they wouldn't drink alcohol, and this fed into Taylorism because drunken workers aren't very efficient, to say the least. And so this was to try to make people more efficient for industry. Um, you guys will be reading a speech from Teddy Roosevelt, who talks about the need for strong labor and all that, and doesn't really pay any attention to the need for people to be paid well. Um, Instead, it's more about the strenuous life. But his speech is also more about like imperialism than anything else. But the uh, the the temperance movement, along with all this focus on on reforming the system, um, started to say that they wanted actual legislation. And so a lot of like Western states and Southern states started actually passing uh, uh, temperance laws. I'm forgetting the word for it now. Prohibition. There we go. Um, they passed prohibition laws, and they were prohibiting the use of alcohol within counties and states and all that kind of stuff. Um, if you've ever been to a dry county, that means that some of those dry counties still have leftover prohibition laws, um, and others would pass it later on. But um, this was the movement towards prohibiting alcohol in the U.S. altogether, and this was part of this kind of mixing of socialism with Taylorism and populism, turning into this heady mix in the 1890s, and ultimately fueled by a religious movement known as the social gospel. Now, the social gospel is this weird thing that essentially, prior to the 1890s, um, with things like the Great Awakening in the 1820s, or the one way before that in the 1720s. Um, these religious movements tended to want to keep the government away, to not that the that it was the Lord's word to act to behave correctly, and morals should not be dictated by the government. Um, but in the with the social gospel, this was this turn towards trying to implement social justice, and by um, either by charity or by government imposed charity. Um, as in, to help the poor, especially since you have all this socialism rising up. The social gospel said we need to do something about that. That's what God commandeth. Essentially, they're saying that that charity, as Jesus said upon the mount, should that blessed are the meek, blessed are the so and so. It's in the New Testament, and they'd use that passage to say, um, well, the only way we can implement such blessings is by having the government step in and provide for social justice. Um, so the you have all of this heady mix, but most of it in opposition to Republicans. But one Republican would become kind of the charismatic leader of um, of progressivism. What would be the answer to reform from the Democrats would be even greater reform called progressivism from the Republicans, but it had to come from one person, and that being Theodore Roosevelt, or Teddy Roosevelt for short. Um, so Teddy is a very weird figure in the late 19th century. Um, he he had kind of cultivated a personality around. For instance, he had done some ranching out in Wyoming. Basically, what is called a dude ranch. That's ranching for publicity, kind of. He'd bring out politicians from New York and that to come and visit his ranch, and kind of show them around how ranching is cool and all that kind of stuff. But um, prior to him heading out west, he'd actually already started his life in politics, and had actually uh, published a work for his master's um, on Navy history. Um, so Teddy Roosevelt was actually a historian. Um, so he kind of knew what he was doing when he moved out west to show off being a cowboy. Um, Remember, we've talked about how that whole frontier myth, how Americans thought that like they had created a new nation by conquering the West. Um, so once he had spent some time out in Wyoming, and notably, he actually tried to take part in a range war that was out there and was refused for being too much of a city slicker. But you know, don't let that dissuade you. He absolutely wanted to be seen as a cowboy, even though cowboys saw him as a city slicker. But he ended up making a lot of contacts with gunslingers and all that kind of stuff, and would use those contacts in the future. So then he came back to New York and started working as a historian, um, notably writing what's known as the Winning of the West, a whole series of books about how the U.S. conquering the West had made a new nation and all that kind of stuff. But he also relied heavily on what's called germ theory, which is essentially that only white Europeans could have conquered the West because there's something innate in Europeanness that makes it good at conquering things, and you know that they had a destiny to conquer the West. Um, and he continued writing throughout the rest of his life, actually. Um, in fact, becoming a founding member of the American Historical Association, um, which kind of started in 1882 but was chartered in 1889 by Congress. It is still the uh, the highest organization in the land for American historians. So especially like academic historians are almost always members of the AHA. Um, so Teddy had a hand in founding it. Um, but he also knew that with all this talk of cowboys and American gusto and that, he had to work in the military. So he started off in the New York militia, ended up getting appointed the vice secretary of the Navy in 1896 by the uh, McKinley administration. But during the McKinley administration, the Spanish American War broke out. And so he created his own group of volunteer um, cavalrymen and called the Rough Riders to go and fight at places like San Juan Hill. Really made a name for himself, but he also, because of his cowboy background and that, a lot of the people that he drew from to volunteer were former friends and gunslingers that he knew back from his ranching days. Um, so this was actually quite an old breed for a bunch of soldiers, especially considering a lot of Teddy's background was actually in naval history. It's kind of funny that he turned to the cavalry. But cowboy image, it's all about kind of making an image for himself. You can tell that a lot of this is not really about doing the thing that he's showing off. It's about showing off. But then um, he had quite a career in New York. Following this, he had already been the police commissioner there up until he was appointed Secretary of the Navy. And then when he returned, he became governor for a year. Um, and during his governorship, he ran an anti-corruption campaign. Tammany Hall, the Democratic stronghold and kind of party machine that kept turning out more and more corrupt politicians, um, needed breaking up, and so he ran. Although he was a Republican, so you can tell this is not just purely about anti-corruption; it's also about rooting out his political opponents. But this started. This kind of gave him a name for being a reformer. That he wanted to stamp out all of this corruption, um, and also made a very prominent, politician for the little guy because he's always showing off of being a cowboy and whatnot rather than a businessman. So he clearly wasn't going to cozy up to big business. And so um, in the election of 1900, um, he was basically sidelined by being offered the vice presidency. This was normally a place that people go and did nothing. Vice presidents were not powerful whatsoever. But fortune struck for him, but not McKinley, because McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist in 1901. I mean, and so this assassination meant that Teddy Roosevelt, the person that the Republican Party had actually tried to sideline by putting in the vice presidency, was now the most powerful leader in the country. And so he came right out of the gate with progressive policies, starting off what he called the Square Deal, um, which was essentially a bunch of reforms trying to trying to move away from laissez-faire capitalism. Um, so, trying to impose social justice through the government, that whole social gospel thing, but took cues from all the previous movements, such as the populists, especially the populists, and socialists. So, generally, the Square Deal goes by the three C's. You have conservation of natural resources, control of corporations, and consumer protection. Um, so, conservation of natural resources, you have things like the Park Service and the and places that had not already been given away under the Homestead Act would remain under the federal control. For instance, much of Nevada today is still under federal control because of this, although partially because most of that land is pretty inhospitable. Um, but the Park Service was created to keep a lot of pretty parks in government control, but also to start controlling national forests, so that like foresting companies and that had to work through the government in order to make sure that they weren't deforesting the United States. This was pretty haphazard at first. It wasn't a single organized thing under the Department of the Interior at first, but it grew over time, and Teddy Roosevelt planted the seeds. But his biggest um, change out of the gate was to start using what's called the Sherman Antitrust Act. Now, the Sherman Antitrust Act had actually been passed in 1890, but had only really been used to trust bust labor unions up until this point. And essentially, what that allows the government to do is to label something as a monopoly and either fine something for monopolistic practices, or to break up the company, because all corporations are chartered by the government. So the government has full rights to break up any corporation it wants. Um, so the so one of the first ones that he went after, though it would take years of court battles, because part of the Sherman Antitrust Act requirements is to actually prove that something is a monopoly, but they went after Standard Oil, which was the corporation ran by John D. Rockefeller, the richest man in American history. Jeff Bezos, for instance, the current richest person, but if you were to calculate for proportion of the gross national product, or GDP, gross domestic product, um, Jeff Bezos actually is not as rich as John D. Rockefeller was at the turn of the 20th century. Um, and so, very obvious target for this regime of trust busting. Um, but it took a lot of court battles to fight, and also considering it was ran by the richest man in American history, you can understand what kind of lawyers he could hire to really extend that battle. It was eventually completed in 1910, though. But this was really trying to show what progressivism could do by forcing competition between companies that were previously monopolies. Um, then he also had a lot of pro-labor reform, which um, that he essentially said that there should be a board to work out any kind of major um, labor disputes. This never actually was implemented, but was did come into force by another Roosevelt, um, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 30 years later with the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, which is still in effect today. But just the proposal of that was enough. Well, the passage of legislation, but never the implementation, um, was enough to kind of show what could be done to try to control corporate greed. Um, the other thing, the other C, consumer protection, had to do with things like um, trying to make it so that um, retailers couldn't discriminate against minorities. He was not particularly effective at doing this, and many historians point out that he didn't really speak too much about this supposed want to end Jim Crow and that. Um, this is a time when Jim Crow really was coming into being, and if he had been more forceful, he very easily could have stunted Jim Crow's growth. But instead, this seems to be much like a lot of Teddy's personality, surface dressing to gain votes. But because of a sensational sensational publication called The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, um, that really exposed a bunch of problems with the meat packing industry. For instance, there was a documented case of somebody falling into a mincer and then that actually being produced into burger meat. So people were literally fed human flesh. Um, this was one case, but quite a sensational case. So the uh, the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Acts in 1906 created the the FDA, as it is today, um, which essentially allowed the government to inspect and put US, approved by USDA stamps on everything. We still have this today, and it maintains that if it's been inspected, that this should not, that people should not be getting sick from uh, from eating food or possibly accidentally cannibalism. Um, the so the this was quite a bunch of progressive reform. He also, after all that craziness in the Philippines, wanted to reform, um, wanted to reform international policy. Um, Open imperialism was no longer okay, so he came up with what's called the Roosevelt Corollary, which is a corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, as in the U.S. reserves the Western Hemisphere of to be free of European imperialism. But we didn't really have any way of enforcing it until the Roosevelt Corollary, which you might have heard before is was summarized by Teddy as "speak softly and carry a big stick." So don't start fights, but be capable of ending them. You know, um, so down the first of these kinds of tests happened in Panama right at the beginning of his administration. Panama was having a revolution, and um, Teddy sent a couple of gunboats down there to they Panama at this point was part of Colombia, and Colombia obviously wanted to keep Panama, but the Panamanian uh, isthmus is particularly useful for possibly digging a canal across it. And so the US had a lot of interest in building that canal. And so um, the US parked a couple of gunboats offshore and basically said, don't try anything, Colombia. They're free now. um, and for their troubles, for, basically our help, they signed a treaty allowing the US to create this canal and run it ourselves. It remained American land. The canal itself remained American land until 1999, um, though it did not have an expiration date on that land until the 1970s. Um, this was initially granted in perpetuity, as in the U.S. could have kept the Panama Canal within the U.S. forever. Um, there was another such crisis where um, uh, oil and rubber workers in Venezuela were under threat uh, by local government in terms of nationalization, and Teddy did his typical thing of sending a couple of gunboats. Um, Sometimes this is called gunboat diplomacy, as you can tell. It's essentially the U.S. saying like, "Hey, we don't want to start a war, but we can end it if you try." Um, so gunboat diplomacy is actually pretty effective in the early 20th century. So you know, Teddy's just hitting it out of the park with this big stick policy. And then there was a war that broke out between the Russians and Japanese, um, and really interrupted U.S. trade in China, especially in Manchuria. And the Japanese were just kicking the Russians' butts. So um, Teddy offered to negotiate the peace between them, and they had a summit in San Francisco where Teddy brokered peace between the two countries, the two imperial powers. Um, Obviously, still trying to maintain U.S. Dominance over China and everything, but also trying to curtail the expansion of Russia. He was very much siding with Japan here. Um, and he actually won a Nobel Peace Prize for it. Um, so we've had two presidents get Nobel Peace Prizes, him and Obama. Although a Jimmy Carter has won a Nobel Peace Prize, but not during his presidency. Um, the um, so with all of these accomplishments, he started to hand off. He had to hand off the mantle of progressivism to his vice president for the 1908 election. So his um, his vice president Taft uh, became the took on the mantle of progressivism, but Taft was actually more conservative. He's an old line politician, who, while making a lot of waves. For instance, one of his campaign slogans was "Take advice from Theodore," um, as in the initials of his last made up his last name, Taft. Um, he was he was you know, much more conservative with a lot of this stuff. But he absolutely increased trust busting. That's the one thing that he absolutely um, pushed as much as possible. He also pushed for the creation of the 16th Amendment, um, which was going to overhaul the tariff system because tariffs um, kind of hurts farmers significantly. Tariffs tend to hurt farmers the most, and the U.S. would be a majority rural country up until 1920. So remember when we talked about the populists and the Grange movement and all that kind of stuff? Um, this was kind of a way of appeasing the Grange movement and all that monetary systems overhauling. So what the 16th Amendment did was create an income tax. Now, there had been an attempt to create an income tax in 1894, but had been ruled unconstitutional a year later. Um, there had also been an income tax during the Civil War. Um, but, no ruling was held over that one because, well, it was the Civil War. A lot of war measures were quite unconstitutional, but, just went unnoticed. Um, so that's why they needed to pass the 16th Amendment. So this was actually a long term Republican issue. Um, so in right at the beginning of Taft's presidency, um, the Republicans actually raised the tariff, um, which did so over Taft's veto, but they passed it anyways. So there was plenty of party infighting already because of progressivism. Um, but this was also to pay for all the social programs that had been passed under um, the Roosevelt administration. Things like the USDA. Um, so the amendment was passed, but wouldn't actually be ratified until um, Taft was out of office. So the tariff remained extraordinarily high. And Republicans would remain pro tariff, save for the progressives in the party. And that was kind of it domestically. There was the 16th Amendment and trust busting. Taft really didn't push any more social reform. And the especially the concerns over radicalism in labor and that should have pushed him to continue pushing that whole um, labor relations reform. But Taft was, fairly conservative. Um, and in 1910, only a year um, into Taft's um, presidency, his Secretary of State rebuked him at a Republican National Convention for basically not doing right by all the reforms that Teddy Roosevelt had done, and Taft fired Pinchot because of this rebuke. He also turned away from the more gunboat diplomacy stuff to what he called in 1910 replacing dollars for bullets. So instead of gunboat diplomacy, he had dollar diplomacy, which favored arbitration rather than gunboats, as in kind of what Teddy had done with the Russo-Japanese War, but with local conflicts in the Western Hemisphere. This didn't mean that he wasn't that he was opposed to interventions, though, but they had to be after some sort of arbitration and typically focused on basically taking economic control over a country. This was exemplified in Nicaragua when he intervened in Nicaragua on behalf of the United Fruit Company. These are called um, banana wars. And he intervened in 1909 to take hold of the customs house where you impose tariffs and everything, to take control of the customs house for a year and saying who should be um, the president of Nicaragua. This went pretty well. It was actually done by request of the national government in 1909 and 1912. But in 1912, that was an election year, and he kept the Marines there. Um, this would end up being, depending on your definition, the longest war in American history. Um, from the U.S. would remain in Nicaragua from 1912 to 1934. There was a year from 1925 to 26 that the U.S. had actually gotten out, but the U.S. would remain in Nicaragua for the better part of a couple of decades. Um, so the although Afghanistan is coming pretty close to surpassing that number, um, still have a few more years, but it depends on how you define longest war. It wasn't really a war; it was an occupation of Nicaragua and key points in Nicaragua. Very little of it involved fighting. Although in the 1930s it got really nasty with the Sandino people following a guy named Sandino there. Um, but this was viewed as completely different from how Teddy was going to do it. That whole big stick policy was kind of taken out with Teddy leaving office. You see, even Puck Magazine was making fun of it in 1908 when Taft was elected, because Taft was very open about like not wanting to use gunboat diplomacy, but then ended up using having wars of occupation, which are, kind of worse. And so Teddy did not like all of this going down, especially since so much of it was done in his name. Um, and so when it came to the election of 1912, um, Teddy Roosevelt openly opposed Taft at the National Republican National Convention, the RNC. Um, so at the RNC, Taft basically abandoned his platform of progressivism in that, turning right back to the, and when I say conservative here, this is the term liberal was mostly used. The term conservative was used for Democrats, but we would call it conservative today. They basically Taft turned from progressivism to liberalism. Is what people were, especially Roosevelt, was complaining about. So he openly opposed all of the social justice legislation that Teddy Roosevelt had proposed. Um, he the occupation in Nicaragua was clearly opposed to the whole speak softly and carry a big stick thing, and he started to give out favors in terms of especially since Roosevelt was keep um, trying to keep trying to remove Taft from the nomination. Taft started promising a bunch of politicians um, certain positions in the government in order to secure their votes. Um, this was kind of a recreation of the spoils system that had been eliminated in the 1880s. It's kind of like the first push towards progressivism. So you could tell this was not, this was a full on turn to the right. Um, and especially since the South tends to always be a lot more conservative, Southern Republicans voted for Taft at the RNC, um, composing kind of the solid block of uh, of votes for Taft, and that allowed Taft to cinch the nomination. The problem was the South was not voting Republican at this point. Republicans were too liberal for the South. The South had Redeemer and Bourbon Democrats. So this was the time of the solid South. We talked about that with the Jim Crow lecture. Um, Ever since the end of Reconstruction, they voted Democrat the entire time, going all the way until the 1940s would be the time that they start to split from the Democratic Party. So these these Southern delegates didn't really matter, but parties get to set their own rules, and so because of all of this, Roosevelt pulled out and created his own party. Um, so he was either there's kind of a larger question. That's why it says egoism versus ideology. There's this larger question of whether or not Teddy was, mad that Taft was ruining his legacy, or if it was truly about, the ideology of progressivism. Um, in either case, he created the Progressive Party. Um, it became known as the Bull Moose Party after, during a speech that Teddy Roosevelt was giving, somebody came up and shot him in the chest, and he fell down for a little bit, got back up, and started delivering the speech as if as if he hadn't just been shot. Um, Apparently, a mini book in his breast pocket is what saved his life. It was a minor flesh wound. It had naturally gotten past the rib cage, but you know, this was seen as quite the feat. So it became known as the Bull Moose Party because um, Roosevelt was seen as strong as a bull moose. Um, Essentially, if you run into a moose who is charging, that's what a bull moose is a charging moose. There ain't nothing stopping that thing. Um, you know, you can fire whatever rifle you got. You just need to get out of the way. And so that was kind of the euphemism of what the Bull Moose Party was. It was this movement towards progress that couldn't be stopped. So uh, Teddy Roosevelt fought for women's suffrage. Um, he actually wanted all kinds of election reform. He very openly supported um, the end of disenfranchisement, because of Jim Crow and that. He also wanted a national health care system, um, and nationally provided insurance for like against theft and that. So if so basically property insurance provided by the government. Um, and this national healthcare system is something we're still fighting over today, still do not have. And this was proposed in 1912. Um, he also wanted, in terms of labor reform, he wanted an 8-hour workday and a minimum wage, both things that would not be implemented until the 1930s. And you can see that there's a lot of kind of things that are even that are thought of as being people who are calling national healthcare stuff socialist today, but like back then it was just called progressive. um so all of this stuff happening where you have both Taft running as a Republican and Theodore Roosevelt running as a progressive, this split the vote, and you ended up with this. The video footage is kind of in the way. Okay, and you can see here that um, while the combination of progressives and Republicans took the majority of votes, um, it split right down the middle right there. And so you ended up with obviously, Teddy was more favored. He'd always been playing this political game of being a cowboy and fighting for the little guy in that. So of the people who voted towards the Republican side, they tended to go for the Progressive Party. But you can see the Democrats ended up cinching the vote with only 42%. Um, and so while this big splotch of blue across the entire country is kind of misleading because you know Woodrow Wilson only got 42%, but he came in as a dark horse candidate, having been a former professor at Princeton University, and cinched the vote because the Republicans were split. And that is what we will talk about next time, is Wilson's presidency. Um, but you can see here, splitting the vote doesn't really work out too well sometimes, to say the least. So there was this like how Eric, I did not see your comment earlier, but yes, accidental cannibalism is the worst. So the um the question I want to pose you guys is, what was the point of progressivism? There's this kind of open thing, like in Europe it is very much about like moving to a lot of progressives in Europe are called social democrats, but here um like we consider social democrats like Bernie Sanders and that today to not just be progressives but like even further to the left of progressives. So what was the point of progressivism?
Do you think like it could be possible to say that it's part of it would be to, I mean, maximize profit, right?
How so?
I mean, for like big corporations and things like that, maximize profit, maximize their, I guess, the footprint, so to speak, on American culture and their.
It seems to do the opposite, doesn't it? Things like trust busting and labor
Yeah.
relations laws.
So I don't know.
Anybody else want to give it? I mean, this is an open question, by the way. There's no correct answers, but um, you know, progressivism had a point, and it absolutely had to do with like the state of capitalism. Andrew wrote in the chat saying, I think it was geared towards the equality of wealth distribution in the country. So wealth redistribution is one answer you could give. Yeah. It's like um, it's stuff like an income tax rather than a tariff would redistribute uh, wealth by taxing the rich and allowing for social programs. It also means that these monopolies can't hold so much power in that, right? Um, so yeah, wealth redistribution is one way of putting it, but it's not like socialist wealth redistribution where it's um, literally like trying to um, instead of trust busting, it's nationalizing and things like that. When an industry becomes too powerful, it gets nationalized. That would be socialism rather than progressivism. Progressivism trust busts, and has these kind of moderate policies of social justice. So anybody else want to take a crack at it?
Well, what I think is looking at this is kind of like before progressives really gained some steam with Teddy Roosevelt and a little bit of Taft. Before that, it was a lot of more or less moderate politics with a lot of corruption, and I think with that and with the rise of progressives throughout history, it's because people want progress to be made. They don't want the same thing to go on for 30 years, go on more, and progressives by name promise some kind of change. They promise whether it's whatever kind of change, they promise some kind of change. As Teddy Roosevelt promised. I mean, he was proposing ideas like women's suffrage that wouldn't come into effect for another
Hold
couple
on a second.
decades.
Somebody's honking outside my window. Sorry about that. Say that again.
I mean, yeah, he was proposing women's suffrage, which wouldn't come into effect for at least another decade or more. I can't remember exactly when the amendment was passed, but nationwide health care, which is still, as you said, today. But it's just he changed things. He's not following the status quo. Like through 1870 through 1900, a lot of the same presidents followed the laissez-faire capitalist kind of system without any change. So progressives, I think, have success, especially Teddy Roosevelt, because they promise some sort of change.
So, I mean, we saw that a lot in 2008 with Obama's election. Was his constant call for change, right? But even then it wasn't as clearly directed towards progress as Roosevelt, especially. Like the healthcare system that we did get from the Obama administration was quite different from what Roosevelt was proposing, right? But you also hit on the term laissez-faire, as in a change of capitalism, right? So a lot of historians like to call what we'll be talking about later on in class in a couple of weeks called the New Deal. But this is kind of the first instance of New Dealerism, hence why it was called the Square Deal. That a lot of historians call it reform capitalism. That essentially it is trying to reform the capitalist system. It's not trying to end capitalism like socialism does, but tries to end at least laissez-faire capitalism. So this is very much aimed at combating laissez-faire capitalism. That's the change, right? And the various ways of going about reforming capitalism is what Taft and Roosevelt were fighting over. We'll see with Wilson on Thursday that even he had some reform in mind, but mostly monetary and bureaucratic reform. But it's that reforming the capitalist system. There's elements of social justice in there as well, but like the main brunt of it is trying to reform capitalism. So we have a couple of good answers here with wealth redistribution and reform capitalism. But there's many other ways of thinking about it. One could say that they didn't really know where they were going, right? They were just trying to make things better. Just blanket change for the sake of it. But it's open to interpretation. So I will leave you guys at that. It is time to go. So I will see you all on Thursday. Do not forget that there will be a quiz online. Should only take about 10 to 15 minutes. So that will be up on Wednesday through Friday. Otherwise, have a good day.